Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this video, let's just go ahead and discuss about something which is important not only in terms of React but also in terms of general computer science, and that is understanding about state machines. Now, we will not dive, very deep into state machines. They are a very vast topic if you want to study them, but just to give you an idea, what you can do with state machines is that you create a sort of logic where you transfer a state of a particular program from one state to another. Let me explain how that works. So let's say your program starts, right? It starts. Now, let's say you have 10 buttons on your page which do different things. So whenever a user clicks on a single button, the program then transitions into a different state, right? So the flow would look something like this. You will have an initial state start here. Then you will have, I cannot really draw it here, would probably need a whiteboard or something, but you will have 10 arrows which indicate that, hey, when you click on button 1, you transition to that state, button 2, transition to that state, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on and so forth. Right now, it is possible that clicking on one of these buttons probably makes an HTTP request, and then that request might fail, might not fail, right? So you again have those nested sort of things where in a state it could transition to another place. For example, if it is an error state, so you would probably have an intermediate state and then move on to an error state. Now, why I'm talking about this is because in real world, when you're creating React components, it is a very good idea, especially we'll see that with the HTTP example later on. It is a very good idea to have a sort of a state instead of playing with Boolean values, right? You're going to probably see something like some logic like this in a lot of code bases, right? So they might flip the busy to true if, let's say, you're making an HTTP request, and flip it to false if they're not making, if they're done making an HTTP request. But the thing is, with network request, you can be in a lot of different states, not just making and not making. You might be making, you might have made and failed, you might have a cache hit. So you can be in a lot of states. You might have a successful response, but a wrong sort of format of the response from server. So how do you account for all that stuff? So for this, what you should do probably, we'll take an example of HTTP later on, but for let's say this particular button, the way you do it is like we discussed in advanced React hooks. Making use of the use reducer hook is pretty convenient in this case. So what you can do is you can say state and dispatch, right? And you can say use, let's say, reducer with a reducer function, right? And your initial state could be, we can define that. So let's say a reducer function is something like this, which would accept an action, right? And then we switch to action.type, and depending on what we have received, we're gonna be pretty much, we can destruct it here only. So type and payloads. So if we have the type, we can say case. Let's say if this is something like pressed once, so you are creating a state where you are on pressed 0 initially. Then when you click on press 1, you return pressed 2, or maybe like, state is pressed 2. Pretty much anything you want with additional metadata if you want to store. If you're on press 2, you return to state of pressed 3. And if you're on case state of press 3, you just return state pressed 1, right? So I have created a cyclic sort of state machine here, right? And once you do that, you could pretty much use reducer is not defined. So let's import that. And right here, you can say your state starts with, let's say, pressed 1, right? So whenever you click on this button, instead of incrementing it this time, what we can do is probably say dispatch. And okay, so a couple of fixes here. We don't really need to switch on type, and first of all we need state. So we're gonna have a state dependency. I hope you understand how a use reducer works. If not, go back to advanced React hooks and you will be explained in a much better detail. So the first argument, just to give you a small crash course, the first argument would be automatically filled by React, and the second argument is what you passed inside your dispatch function. So we can pretty much get rid of the dispatch, and in fact we can get rid of this as well, to be honest, because we are not using anything. So we can just switch on the state itself. So if it is on press 1, we do that, and so on and so forth. So once we do this, get rid of this, we can probably say something like, or maybe like, you know, we can move this logic of on click inside another div, and inside this div I can say, let's say, the state of the actual thing which we have, right? So we click on this and cannot destructure undefined, as it is undefined. So let's not destructure it at all. So if I click on this, you can see we have created a sort of a state machine, right? So when I click on this, we go to this. When I click on this, we go to this. When I click on this, we go to this. This is extremely powerful concept in terms of, just like I said, if we are working with HTTP information, right? So maybe once we are on, let's say, initial request, I want to switch the state to loading. Once we have made the request, I switch the state to loaded. If that is an error, I switch the state to error. If it is success, I switch the state to success. And depending on how our response looks like or how our state is, we render a different version of component, right? So this is a very basic and simple example of how you can create a cyclic state with use reducer. But in the next video, let's take up an example of an HTTP request to understand this in a much better detail.